So this is a very upsetting start to 2019. Mean Gene Okerlund was pronounced dead on January 2nd, 2019, which may be the first celebrity death of the year. I'm not sure. I haven't actually checked that yet. And for those who don't know who he is, Mean Gene was a wrestling interviewer in the 1980s, 1990s for the WWF, now known as the WWE. So why was Mean Gene so important to the WWE, or at the time WWF? Well, nowadays interviewers in the WWE or wrestling in general aren't used as often or aren't utilized as effectively as they were back in the day. Because now most wrestlers, when they do promos, they just do them inside the ring. They're given maybe a little bit of like, oh, here's what we want you to say. And then they hop into the ring and kind of do their thing. By themselves or maybe with another wrestler in the ring. Really varies on the situation. But back in the day, especially in the 80s, wrestlers had to rely more on these one-on-one backstage interviews to get their promos out and to try to introduce their characters to the wide wrestling audience. And the wrestlers during these promos wouldn't just rely on Mean Gene to ask them questions. They'd also need to be able to bounce off them to help portray their character to the audience. And Mean Gene made a career off of that. He was able to not only interview the wrestlers, ask the questions he needs to ask them, like every other interviewer could do, he actually found a way, in most cases, to become a part of the interview without overshadowing the wrestler, being used less as an interviewer and more as a tool to be used by the wrestler to help get them over. And if you guys want a good example of this, watch any of the interviews with Mean Gene and Macho Man Randy Savage. Randy Savage would usually bring some sort of prop, whether it be cream canisters for coffee or candy canes, and he would just throw it into his promo, and Mean Gene would just lean into it. He would just let the Macho Madness run wild, brother. And I don't know, it just worked. And I don't think any other interviewer at the time would either let that happen or actually contribute to those bits as much as Mean Gene did. And I think the most amazing thing about Mean Gene's run in the WWF was that despite having to basically interview big stars like, as I said, Macho Man Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, and Roddy Piper, who had his own little interview show in the WWF, which would create an interesting dynamic whenever Mean Gene had to interview Roddy Piper. That's another interview you guys should check out. But anyway, I was going on a little bit of a tangent. Despite having to interview and be in the same room and in the same segment as these amazing superstars, he was still able to carve out his own identity among the roster, despite not being a wrestler. To the point where even to this day, whenever he did make appearances on WWE TV, which usually he did around WrestleMania, it would get a big pop from the audience, a pop meaning like a cheer or stuff in wrestling terms. Which is amazing because a lot of the interviewers nowadays, like, you don't even know their names. Just hop on screen. They're very, professional, like, kind of like actual sportscasters. And like, hi, my name is da-da-da, let's interview this person. And then they don't really, like, interact with the wrestlers as much as Mean Gene did. Again, Mean Gene kind of became a part of the act. In fact, you weren't only necessarily watching it just to be like, oh, look at this wrestler. You actually also had interest in the interviewer himself, which is unheard of in today's age of wrestling. And some of the more modern wrestling fans or the more younger wrestling fans might not actually know how much Mean Gene actually affected the industry. In fact, he's actually before my time. I only really started watching wrestling in like the late 1990s, early 2000s. Like, I think the first match I saw was TLC 99. And the first feud I really got into was Cactus Jack and Triple H in 2000, I believe. However, my older brother would collect old VHS tapes of old WWF shows and also WCW shows. And I remember watching it, and I actually remember seeing Mean Gene on it. And thinking, oh, cool, another Mean Gene interview. And as I got older, I got to kind of appreciate his contributions to the business even more, to the point where I was one of those people popping when he pops up at WrestleMania, or when he was the host of the Wrestling Bedtime Stories or Wrestling Stories on the network, a little animated story time bit they did. Or when he was on Legends House with Shawn Michaels, Jimmy Hart, and all that. And I'm going on another babble fit, so I'm going to end it with this. Mean Gene didn't live up to his name. When you hear about celebrities dying, you always hear little peeps being like, oh yeah, it sucks he died, but he was actually an asshole. Or, oh, this is, hear about this scandal, or this, or she was a bad woman, or like, something. But no, everyone is kind of in agreement on this one. That Mean Gene was a gentleman, he was a kind man, and he had a love for the business. And that will be the legacy that people will remember him by for years. Rest in power, Mean Gene Okerlund.